So you know why you're here, and and how many of you subscribe to a real newspaper, an actual newspaper? All right, that's what I like to see here. Ink on paper. Look, he's waving his copy of the newspaper. I like this. I appreciate this man. I would have gotten you a front row seat had I known about that. All right.
I didn't want to sit over here. I missed the angle.
Okay. Do we have? No, we don't have anybody blocking the line of sight. In our Washington bureau at the LA Times years ago, you may remember during the Carter administration when interest rates went so high. And farmers were going under. That's when they had Farm Aid and Willie Nelson, because I come from a farm family. And what farmers do is borrow money at the beginning of the season to buy seed and all the things you need, and then you pay it all back when the crop comes in. Well, the interest rates were going so high, so fast, that farmers weren't able to do that. So some of them converged on Washington, D.C. in what was called the tractorcade, and they blocked traffic just to make their point to all those people in Washington that they couldn't make a living this way. Well, my friend Paul Houston in the Washington Bureau went out to cover this, and he saw a woman who got out of her car, and he walked up to see what was going to happen. Her way home was blocked. She was obviously not happy, and she was waving her fist and yelling, "I don't need you farmers. I get my food at the grocery store." And this is kind of the predicament we find ourselves in with newspapers, because I ask people, where do you get your news? Oh, we get it from Google, we get it from Facebook. Well, where do you think Google and Facebook get it? Facebook does not have a bureau in Sacramento. Google is not covering the Pentagon. That's what real reporters at real newspapers are doing. And then it gets sucked up into the vacuum of the internet and distributed as if they came just by magic by all this news. So it's worth remembering and imagining a time, even 50 years ago, but 100 years ago, you take every cell phone, every tablet out of every pair of hands, and you put a newspaper there instead. And you get a sense of what it was like as long ago as 200 years ago and as recently as, say, 30 years ago. Look at that image. The Titanic was sinking, and how do people find out about it? Through the newspapers. The paradox is that this country, which now derides newspapers and fake news in some quarters, was built on newspapers. We would not have a country were it not for newspapers, because 400 years ago, we're talking Virginia colony, the royal governor of Virginia thanked God, literally thanked God, that there were no unlicensed printing presses, because he said learning has brought disobedience. Disobedience. And the British Crown in Massachusetts cautioned that great inconvenience may arise from the liberty of printing. Well, what do you think that would happen to that with the Revolution? The Revolution said, bring it on. And printing presses were almost literally worth their weight in gold. They had to be smuggled out ahead of the Brits. And a secret printing press that was set up near Lexington and Concord published the publisher's eyewitness to that battle. And the British officer, you can almost hear him on CNN. Imagine CNN there during the Revolution. He said, "Disperse, you damned rebels, disperse." And there was that quote in big print in a newspaper that wasn't supposed to have been printed. So as the nation grew, newspapers pushed it out and also pulled it forward. Because to be considered a real town, you had to have a newspaper. That was what the town fathers thought. And sometimes there were towns as small as 2,000 people who had 2 or 3 newspapers, and the residents read them all. These were competing and dueling papers. And the printing press that I said was worth its weight in gold, imagine, they were made in Boston, they were made in New York, they were made in Cincinnati in very expensive foundries, and so they were coveted, they were cherished, they were hard to get. When they got a newspaper and a printing press in Missoula, Montana, when it was still a territory, they were so excited that they stopped the wagon with the printing press outside of town and decked out the horses in red ribbons. So it was like a parade coming into town. And Boulder, Colorado had a printing press, but one town over did not. And they were very jealous and very covetous. And this sounds biblical, doesn't it? So they got the editor drunk and then stole the printing press and took it back over to their town. Now, the editor's version is that they got him drunk, but maybe they paid him off. I don't know. In Kansas, in Delphos, Kansas, in 1879, there was a cyclone, like the one you saw in The Wizard of Oz. And it tore the town apart, and it scattered the bits of the printing press far and wide. But the publisher was so determined to let the people in town know what was happening to their town, what had happened, that he assembled a printing press, a rudimentary one, on the stump of a tree in downtown and managed to get out a copy of the Delphos Herald. So that's the spirit of newspapering. That's one of the things I wanted to convey in this book, that it's Newspapers are committed to our hometowns, are committed to our country, good times and bad, because we're telling our own stories. We are the American scrapbook. If you saw the film Nebraska, where the character Woody wanders into the local weekly paper, and those enormous bound volumes where he was turning the pages, and he saw a story about himself in the service, he saw stories about his family in the military. It's the pancake suppers, it's the prep sports. Those are our stories, and that's what newspapers want to tell. And the picture that got me started on this book is the one I'm going to show you. This was the newsroom of the Honolulu Star-Bulletin not long after Pearl Harbor. And you will notice the conditions under which the reporters and the editors are working. Gas masks and blackout curtains. This is what reporters are willing to do to tell the story. I have had colleagues and friends who have been killed in the service of newspapering. Central America, the Mideast, Iran, places like that. We too run toward the gunfire. So over the more than 200 years of our history, of these thousands and thousands of newspapers, some of which have disappeared and rolled away like tumbleweeds, the smallest towns used them for bragging rights, like the picture I'm going to show you. Waco, Texas wasn't much to brag about, but boy, look at their newspaper. The Waco Examiner. I mean, that would do justice to the New York Times. And you can imagine these guys rounding up all their friends saying, come over and pretend like you work here. We're going to take a picture. Dallas, Denver, all of these places had bragging rights for their newspapers. Cities were proud of them and wanted them to succeed. But truth to tell, as we know, not every newspaper did an honest and forthright job, partly because some of the publishers of newspapers, the owners of newspapers, were not journalists. They weren't necessarily interested in newspapering for its own end. They used it to further their political careers. They used it to advance their business interests. Look at the Chandlers. The early Chandlers were interested in real estate. They didn't really care much about journalism. But boy, we can bring that water down from the Owens Valley if we just keep putting it on the front page and scaring people into thinking we've got a water panic. And darn if it didn't work. Now, President Harding owned a newspaper called the Marion Star, and he owned that newspaper well into his presidency. He never had to divest or put it in a blind trust of what we know nowadays. And even as newspapers became about journalism and not about the publisher's ambitions, some of them would not be, we say, aggressive in challenging the official version of events. This was particularly bad with the police and minorities. In Los Angeles, it was sort of, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. The official version of police events was what the newspapers tended to tell. And they had police beat reporters who were issued, I'm going to show you this picture. This item doesn't even exist anymore, and the picture itself is very rare. When you were an LA police reporter, you got a badge from the LAPD, an official badge. And it didn't say sergeant, it didn't say lieutenant, it didn't say patrolman, it said reporter. And all you did was show up at the scene and you flashed that badge, and you got in and you got to look at what was going on. There was a notorious reporter named Aggie Underwood who became an editor who would walk up and sort of mess things around to see what would make the best picture. She was known for, among other things, she took a red or a white carnation from her lapel, threw it on the corpse, and said, "Oh, the white carnation murders." Thankfully, we don't do that sort of thing anymore. And you know, with the Watts riots, when we started to hear that the stories of people of color in these minority communities did not jibe with what the police were saying, you can believe that these badges were pretty quickly recalled when the police didn't like the stories that we were telling. Now, newspapers are always promoting themselves because they want to get you to subscribe. And you may have a pencil or a pen that says Los Angeles Times. There were calorie charts that they sent out. You could tape it on your refrigerator so you would stay thin. Thank you, passive aggressive. They also sent out thermometers that you could put out. And it's funny because I have probably 8 or 10 of these in my collection now. And the ones in Southern California, the temperatures start maybe 10 degrees above zero and go to 110. But in North Dakota, it starts at 50 degrees and goes down to like minus 50, which they're seeing now. During the 1920s, you may have read about the Scopes trial, the trial for teaching evolution in Tennessee. Well, newspapers had to cover this, of course. They covered it lavishly. It was like the round-the-clock CNN news of the day. And they also wanted to take advantage of this story with their own promotional devices like this one from this newspaper in Nebraska, the Hastings Daily Tribune. Is man descended from monkeys? Look on the other side. It's a mirror. That is a great, clever bit of marketing. Now, the great newspaper wars of the 1800s were made possible by technology that finally allowed us to print pictures, that finally allowed us to print color. We could get the news to you faster, and the two biggest names in this war were, of course, William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer. There was a Hearst editor himself who once said that a Hearst paper is like a woman running screaming down the street with her throat cut. I object to that because I think a real Hearst paper would have a naked woman running down the street screaming with her throat cut. Now, the Pulitzer papers had to compete with this, and we call that big type that you see for big events, we call it second coming type in the news business, because when Jesus comes back, that's how big the headline's going to be. Mr. Pulitzer started seeing these headlines in his newspaper, and he was horrified. He went down to the composing room where they keep all those sizes of type that they made up newspapers from, and he ordered his foreman to melt it down because he thought it was disgraceful. He didn't want to see that in his newspaper again. Well, the foreman did not do as he was asked, and sure enough, the Pulitzer papers had to start using second coming type to compete with the Hearst papers and more. Now, as I said, the technology of photography allowed us to get pictures of things that we hadn't been able to before, and in places where, in some cases, we shouldn't have been taking pictures. In the case of the 1920s, they had made cameras small enough that one photographer was able to strap it to his ankle. It was about this big. He strapped it to his ankle, a one-shot camera, and dropped his pants leg over it and went into the death chamber at Sing Sing prison as they were about to execute a woman named Ruth Snyder, and got this picture, which shows you, if you're in favor of the death penalty, this picture shows you what it really means, as the current hit her body. It is a shocking picture nearly 100 years later. It's just a stunning picture. And of course, now nobody can get into a death chamber with a camera, and they search you to make sure of it. But this began back with the Civil War, when you had people like Matthew Brady going out, taking pictures on the battlefield after the battle was over, of course. And for newspapers covering a war, the Civil War or the war in Vietnam, this is, I think, our most sacred duty because it is the government's most sacred duty. It's a serious responsibility when you go to war, how you wage war. And reporters, photographers, and editors think it's very important to use that phrase, lives and treasure, to see where our lives and treasure are going. So the technology got so good during the Civil War. You know, if you were fighting the Battle of Gettysburg, if you were fighting the battle on day 3, you could find out and buy a newspaper about what had happened on day 1. They had newspaper wagons going out back of the lines, selling you the major newspapers where you could read accounts of the war that you were fighting at that moment. That was an extraordinary event. And of course, the photos of the dead from the battlefield brought home the news to people who were getting letters from little Johnny saying, "Don't worry, Mom, I'm fine." We're sitting around the campfire playing banjos and singing, and seeing what war was really like, which their own sons often would not tell them. One of the most influential photos of the Vietnam War was taken by a friend of mine and may have in fact changed the course of the war. One of our guys on our side, the South Vietnamese, mistakenly napalmed a group of kids. And that's the photo that appeared on Sunday front pages in 1972 throughout the United States, taken by my friend Nick Utt, who scooped up this little girl badly burned and took her to a field hospital. She eventually moved to Cuba and became a doctor herself. And she and Nick are now close friends. This is very moving to me, as you can imagine. But when Richard Nixon in the Oval Office saw this, I listened to the Nixon tapes, I was curious. He asked his chief of staff, Bob Haldeman, could this be fake news? He said, could it be a faked picture? And Haldeman said, could be. So even then, you had the sense Nixon knew the impact of this and wanted to see whether he could attack it as being fake. Now, every newspaper has its screw-ups. We devote our second page of the paper to these mistakes. Sometimes they're as small as my misspelling Jon Stewart's name. Boom, I hated myself for that. And sometimes it's a major mistake. But this picture proved that one of the biggest mistakes newspapers had ever made worked to the advantage of the guy who was the victim of it. I think you may remember him and that photo. The Chicago Tribune really wanted Dewey to win. And back then, before polls, they didn't have daily polls. It just looked like Dewey was the guy. And so the Chicago Tribune reporter went with his gut, and that was the headline. And Harry Truman, of course, gloating over the circumstances. Now, with these corrections, which television really doesn't do a good job with corrections. We do corrections. Some of them, as I said, are big. Some of them are small and kind of adorable. The New York Times last year had one of my favorites. They had to correct a dog breed because they said that something was a golden retriever. In fact, he was a Labrador retriever. So they ran a correction but said, he is still a good boy. But more soberingly, in the 1960s, throughout the American South, the white-owned newspapers either ignored the civil rights movement or spent their ink and paper mocking and deriding it. And a few years back, the Lexington Herald-Leader in Kentucky put this on the front page. It has come to the editor's attention that the Herald-Leader neglected to cover the civil rights movement. We regret the omission. But then inside, there was a whole section of the stories and the photographs that they didn't run, that they had never run. And this was their way of trying to say, we're making amends for this. Nowadays, if people don't like what they're reading in the newspaper, they simply cancel their subscriptions. But under the royal government, under the British government, the rules were different. Truth is a defense in a libel case. If you're telling the truth and you're not reckless in what you're telling, you're probably going to win a libel suit as a newspaper, win it against somebody who's suing you. But under the British, to this day, libel suits are easier to bring because truth isn't necessarily a defense. So when you see people, Americans, go to British courts to try a libel suit, it's because the standard of proof is lower there. The laws are different there. Well, in 1734 in this country, a publisher named John Peter Zenger printed what was a true story about the royal governor of New York. It was true. Everything he said about him was true. But it was libelous under British law. And so they didn't just cancel their subscription. They ordered all the copies of that paper to be burned by the hangman. It was a symbolic execution. However, when this went to the jury, the lawyer appealed to the jury as future Americans to make them feel a distance between Britain and said, essentially, as Americans, this is the kind of press we want. And they acquitted the guy. They got him all, and they all went to a tavern and got drunk, which is, an outcome to be wished, I guess. The man who's arguably the first martyr of American journalism was also called the first victim of the Civil War, even though he was murdered in 1837. His name was Elijah Parrish Lovejoy. He opened a newspaper in Missouri. He was anti-slavery. The mob stormed his building, tore it down, and destroyed his printing press. He set up another one in Missouri, and the same thing happened. And then he moved across the river to Illinois, arguably a free state even in those early days when they were fighting over which states were slave and which states were free. And he thought, okay, now I'm all right. So he set up his building, set up his printing press, and the mob came after him again, burned his building, and shot him to death, and threw the printing press in pieces into the river. It has been recovered and to some extent reassembled and is now in a museum. There was one person, one politician in the United States at that time in 1837 who said something about this and deplored the murder, and his name was Abraham Lincoln. And as President Lincoln said that this incident for him lit the fuse that ultimately became the Civil War. Now, you get a newspaper, so you know it's not all doom and gloom. We've got the sports section, we've got the funnies, we've got book review, which I hope you read religiously. Of course you do because you're here. Movie reviews, and the sports section is charming because they can play with words and have fun in a way that it's harder to do in the news sections. So here's this moment with this headline: the breathless, deathless day in the Brooklyn Eagle when the Brooklyn Dodgers won the pennant. Those are the papers that you find in your grandfather's closet when you clean it out, right? And those are the papers we cherish because the stories physically, tangibly mark a moment in our history that matters so much to us. Now, one of the most popular enduring features in the newspaper started in 1913. The very first crossword puzzle ever printed was printed in a newspaper. It was created by a man from Liverpool who came to New York to do newspapering. And it was first called a word cross. How it became crossword, nobody knows. But this means that the Beatles were only the second cultural contribution from Liverpool to the United States. This man was first, and I will show you that crossword puzzle. And it's a little different, but if you sit down, you can still figure it out. So give yourself a try. You can probably find it online and print it out and do that. But this became so popular so fast. As I said, the crossword puzzle has never been out of print, that in the New York Public Library, they had to limit the number of people who were coming in just to look up the answers to crosswords because real scholars could not get in. So it's like, okay, it was like a really tough maitre d'. Okay, 10 people at a time, you get to go in and take the crossword puzzle. As you see, if you think about it, the newspaper cultural influence reaches far beyond the actual newspaper with news in it. You know what a newspaper looks like. You can recognize the silhouette as you would a light bulb or a Coca-Cola bottle. You see those open pages, you go, oh, I know that. That's a newspaper. Newspaper print fabric has become popular too. You know, the Gothic headlines and then the lines of type. So popular that the first bikini ever made, July 1947, I would say it would be unveiled in France, and that would not be a misstatement to use that, was made out of newspaper fabric. I know you're just reading the headlines, right? And that's, you know, pages from Le Monde. Well, probably less than one entire page if you put it together. And the box she's holding, excuse me, the box she's holding is the box the bikini can fit in. And bikini, of course, was named for our testing in the atoll in the Pacific. So it's probably just as well that we didn't do it like first in Vanuatu, because people would go to the beach in Vanuatu's today. It's a little tricky. And the newspaper is also the Swiss Army knife of objects. You can train your puppy with it. You can swat a fly with it. If you live in the Midwest, you can stick it under the tires, you know, when your tires are spinning on the ice or in the mud, and get some traction there. And you can use it, for example, at a costume party to make your costumes. As the Oregon Journal did in the 1950s, all these people are wearing the Oregon Journal. The lady on the right dressed as Peter Pan, I really love that one, that's my favorite. And I like that disembodied Dali-esque hand kind of reaching out in front of the waiter there. But in home ec classes, you had to learn to make clothes out of newspapers. That was part of a lesson in those home ec classes. If you are a criminal defendant, what better way to hide your identity than to cover your face with the newspaper? Although your picture may be on the front page, maybe that's not necessarily the best use. I call this next picture nunbrellas, because there's nothing better to shield you from the sun, even if you're wearing a wimple, than a bunch of nuns watching a horse show in their nunbrellas. So everything that I've showed you, you just try doing that with your iPhone. You know, try swatting a fly. You're not going to get a call through again. So newspapers, as I said, penetrate very deeply into the culture, and there's always been a vogue for newspapers as board games, among other things. Nellie Bly, the pioneering American reporter who challenged the Jules Verne Round the World in 80 Days record, there was a board game issued of Nellie Bly. And after the movie of this particular name in the 1930s, here's the newspaper board game that you can play to pretend you're a reporter. And isn't that just like my life? Real assignments, sensational scoops. And there I am, clutching a piece of paper and wearing a hat with the wrong chromosomes in the newsrooms. But you look, you can see, if you look at the real headlines, Earhart plane, obviously that's 1933, 34. And on the left, Rockingham something. At first I thought it was OJ, but no. So that was well behind us by then. Sensational scoops, I love that part. Let me list some actors for you. Cary Grant, Warren Beatty, Gregory Peck, Jimmy Stewart, Ronald Reagan, and Don Knotts. What do they all have in common? No, they did not win Oscars, Don Knotts, sorry. They've all played newspapermen. It's almost as popular as police and detectives in the movies, because a newspaperman, if you don't want to adhere to accuracy, you can send him out with a gun, you can make him get the girl, you can make him a comic figure. All of these movies that these people have been in, and so many more besides, tell the story of a newspaper reporter as a cultural figure, as a cultural icon. Whether it's Five-Star Final like this, or Spotlight in 2015, or just The Post recently, thank you, Tom Hanks, movie makers like the newspaper man because they can put him in danger, they can send him into difficult situations. And this is a poster from one of our favorite newspaper people's favorites, Humphrey Bogart, Deadline USA. And they're writing a story about a mobster who's guilty of commissioning a murder. And Bogey is down in the press room. The mobster calls on the phone, says, "If you print that story, I'm going to kill you," you know, the usual. And Bogey nods at the pressmen, and you see the presses start to roll, and they pick up speed, and they pick up speed, and the mobster says, "What's that racket?" And Bogey says, "That's the press, baby, the press." It's great. Every time I cheer, it's just wonderful. And this picture is a little bit off topic. John Gavin never played a newspaper man, but if you saw Spartacus, he did play Julius Caesar. And if you ever wondered why the Roman Empire was on such a sound financial footing, there he is reading the Wall Street Journal. Julius Caesar in the Wall Street Journal. So it all paid off. I don't want to overlook the important role of small-town newspapers and weekly newspapers. Those are the ones that are disappearing fastest, and those are the backbone of American community as well as American journalism. There was a recent study by Neiman Labs that in towns where newspapers have disappeared, the bond rate has gone up because the people on the city council, the people on the county board are voting more bond stuff. Let's raise some more money. The newspapers aren't going to call us on it. Who's going to know? And sure enough, when you don't have the watchdogs, the people who are being watched can get away with murder. There are lots of reporters in Washington. There are lots of reporters in New York. But what about a little town in Michigan where all of a sudden the water can kill you? That's Flint, Michigan for you. That's what local reporting is all about. 2 years ago, there was a Pulitzer awarded to a reporter who works for the Charleston Gazette-Mail in West Virginia. Circulation maybe 30,000. This man pried open the books on Big Pharma because he had a question about opioids in West Virginia. Why, for example, in a town of 392 people with one drugstore, why was that drugstore being shipped over 2 years 5 million doses of OxyContin? 392 people, 5 million doses, you do the math. Something was seriously wrong, and there were congressional hearings as a consequence. Lives were saved as a consequence. And his colleague, who covered the coal mining industry in the same town, when they went into Chapter 11 bankruptcy last year, the coal mining executives were at a conference. And when they heard the news, they had a big fake pink slip made up saying, with "You're fired," the name of the reporter who had done such a good job of covering them, that he felt, or that the coal executives felt, they were putting that industry at risk because he was talking about miners, he was talking about safety, he was talking about his neighbors and his friends, people who went down into the mines and came up with black lung after 5 years or 10 years. Those are the important stories. Those are the places where people are at risk. I don't run into in the grocery store the people I cover. But when you work at a local newspaper, you do. You have to be accountable. You have to hold yourself accountable to the people you're writing about, because it could be the person who teaches your fourth grader. It could be the pastor at your school. You need to be able to look them in the face and say, I did this story because it's important and it's true. Every interest likes having a newspaper. Maybe you had a little neighborhood newspaper when you were a child. Harry Potter has a newspaper. I wish our figures moved on the covers and the pictures in our newspaper. But so did they have newspapers in the internment camps, believe it or not. And this is Ansel Adams' picture of the Free Press. Whoops, wrong one. That's the small town newspapers I was talking about. And you see there are women on the staff there. Newspapers afforded an opportunity to women, which I'll talk about in a minute. But I like that printing done with neatness and dispatch. Oftentimes they didn't make enough money selling newspapers, but they would print your flyers and your business cards as well. And there's the Manzanar Free Press, which paradoxically was not free. There were 2 weeks when the paper didn't publish anything at all because there were riots in the camp, and you did not read stories about that. But they felt that they had to have a newspaper about the dances and the bake sales and other things going on there because it gave a sense of normality to life in the camps, even though the sense was that there was nothing normal about being in an internment camp. Now, I showed you a few examples of headline stories like the dead Ruth Snyder one, but if you love a newspaper, you love the headlines. Some of them are funny, some of them are just big and stunning, and those are the ones that people like to keep hold of because they do rush out. Don't you have newspapers in your closet someplace that say blank elected or 9/11 attacks or something? Everybody's got one of those. And to the connoisseurs of this, it matters because you can't Photoshop 700,000 copies of a newspaper. It just can't happen. That's the physical evidence. That's the real thing. And I love this picture because it's 2 American GIs in April 1945, different parts of the world, different theaters, telling the same story with the same headline. Nazis quit. That's all you need, baby. My favorite, though, is the guy on the left because he's drinking beer to celebrate. You know, I think that he deserves a shout out for that. Newspaper headlines have their own language that nobody uses. Do you ever say slain instead of killed? I don't either. Do you ever say taught instead of child? Nope. Nabbed instead of kidnapped? No. But that's newspaper headline language. It has to be short and succinct. And here is, of course, one of the most heartbreaking ones we've seen in the last 150 years in this country. An extra was a street edition. You see it's the Los Angeles Herald-Examiner. It's an unscheduled issue of the paper that's put out on the street when there's a story big enough to justify it. And this, of course, was the biggest story of a generation. The best headline. I was not allowed to put this one in the newspaper because they're so protective of it. This is in the New York Post. It was about a mutilation murder at a strip club. And the editor who wrote the headline, he wrote it in a burst of inspiration, and he said, I want to make sure that it's factually correct. So they sent a reporter out, and she hoisted herself. This was all it was a murder scene. She hoists herself up outside, looks in the window, and sees a flyer inside that says, you know, amateur topless night, Tuesdays. So she goes, okay, topless, there we can do it. So here's the headline. Oops. Damn it, sorry, that's not it. I guess it fell out of the rotation. The headline is Headless Body and Topless Bar. This was, let's see if I've got it. This is the Honolulu Star Advertiser. You remember last January where somebody issued a nuclear alert, incoming missiles that weren't? This is their headline, and they kindly let me use this, and I love this with the button that they're all ready to push to go. Let's see if I've got it. There it is. Headless Body and Topless Bar. And you know what the New York Times headline version of this? The New York Times is very sedate. Owner of bar shot to death. Suspect is held. Well, which paper are you going to buy, right? So, in fact, the story in this paper was probably shorter than the headline, but man, it got your attention. And as you can see, people have kept this one for a very long time. You saw pictures of a couple of women in front of a newspaper in the Rocky Mountains. One of the most shameful parts of newspaper history is how newsrooms were so white and so straight and so male for so very long. And there's a chapter in the book that I call Unseen Faces and Unheard Voices, because not having women, not having people of color, think of all the stories we missed. Half of America, our stories did not get told for so long because it was only about what the guys in the newsroom saw. And they saw working middle, sort of upper middle class version of America. So beyond the official events of Washington, beyond Wall Street, what were the stories that we did not find out, that we did not tell? Here is that woman I mentioned, Aggie Underwood. She became the first woman city editor of a major metropolitan paper at the LA Herald Express. She started as a switchboard operator. And there she is. You see that baseball bat in front of her. She said she kept it to use on PR people. But I know from people who work for her that she was a tough cookie, and she would probably take a swing at you if she absolutely needed to. Aggie was quite something. Beyond the white carnation murders, even her reputation preceded her. This next lady is named Ethel Payne. She was called the First Lady of the Black Press. She worked for the Chicago Defender, and she was probably the first woman accredited to the White House press pool. Here she is in Vietnam, interviewing a soldier there. Her questions during the Eisenhower administration about civil rights and race, her questions were so tough and so challenging that they were trying to find a way to revoke her press credentials, to get her out of the White House press pool, and they were not able to do it. But she was formidable, and you know, her reputation was so substantial that she got on television, on shows like Meet the Press, at a time when that simply did not happen with black reporters. The next picture is of an LA Times reporter named Ruben Salazar, an editor who was killed in 1970 during the Chicano moratorium. He was hit in the head by a tear gas projectile, and it was classified as a homicide, but it was never prosecuted. There was a sheriff's deputy who fired the tear gas projectile. But he was one of the first major Latino voices in print, because before then there'd been Spanish language newspapers, but they were isolated from the mainstream. So the voices and experiences in the Latino community did not get told until you started having people in the newsroom who knew those stories and knew how to tell them. We've been remedying that blind spot, I'm happy to say, for the last 20 or 30 years. But there was a colleague of mine, a Latino reporter, who had been working at the Stockton Record, and this is the 1970s. She goes into the newspaper library to look for clippings, and we clip out every copy of the story in a newspaper and file it under a half dozen subjects, whatever's in it. If it's a car crash, if it's Zsa Zsa Gabor slapping a cop, you've got cop files, you've got Zsa Zsa files, you've got Rolls-Royce files. So she's in there looking for the file on Latinos, and she looks under L for Latinos. She looks under H for Hispanics. She looks under M for Mexicans. The library says, no, it's under W for wetbacks. This is the 1970s. And so we have come a long way, and we have a long way that we have had to come. So the rap on newspapers is that we don't like new technology, but that so isn't true. We didn't see the internet coming, but that doesn't mean we didn't love technology. Anything that lets us print photographs, anything that, like the telegraph, that lets us get stories around there faster, anything big, like the presses, like these LA Times presses I think we have. These are called Ho presses. These are in the basement of the LA Times. And I was still there when these were running before they got moved off to a different plant. And they start by printing what we call the soft sections, the features and the movie reviews that aren't breaking news. And you would feel the paper, the building start to shake a little bit. And it was like, oh my God, that's such a thrill. But then in 1992, when Ross Perot was running for president, his running mate was Admiral Stockdale, who had been a prisoner of war, who came to talk to the political reporters at the paper. And we were sitting in the building talking about policy or programs, and the building starts to shake. And this poor man, you know, out of a POW camp starts to blanch. And I had to lean over and say, Admiral, it's okay, it's just the printing presses, you know, it's not an earthquake or anything like that. I felt so terrible for him. So here are the kinds of presses that would roll hundreds of thousands, up to a million copies of the newspaper off the presses. So I said that we embrace new technology. Radio, the LA Times, you ever watch Channel 11, KTTV in Los Angeles? KTTV, Times Television. That's how it got those call letters, until we were forced to divest because of cross ownership in the 1960s. In 1922, at the dawn of radio, the Portland Oregonian bought a radio station, had a radio car, this car that it sent out to broadcast stories to and about Portland all over the place. Many other newspapers did the same sort of thing. And television, as I said, with the LA Times. Aviation got into this. Glenn Martin, you know, the pioneer in aviation, wanted to show what it could do for newspapers in aviation. So here's the high-flyingest newsboy you ever saw. Glenn Martin, 1912, he's flying newspapers from Fresno to Madeira. And you just hope that he, like, landed the plane before he delivered the newspapers instead of just dropping them off there. But there's still the old-fashioned retail newsstand way of selling newspapers, and this is one of my favorite photographs. It's a former Chicago showgirl. Her name is Bunny Duchesne, and once, you know, she got a little out of the chorus line, she ended up doing this, selling in newspapers or else. I mean, who would say no to this woman? She looks tough. She's got the cigarette, I mean, the lipstick. She's got everything going for her. If she'd been in Hollywood, she would have been cast in a movie by that time. As many of you know, the LA Times has left the LA Times traditional building. We ceased to own it when the Chicago owners took us into bankruptcy. It's a grand building. It was built to make its mark at the intersection of the civic landscape with City Hall, the police station, the county offices. So many newspapers built these newspaper palaces that said, we're here, we're not going away, and we're important, don't mess with us. And so these wonderful buildings that also stroked publishers' egos, yes, but they were monuments on the landscape. Here is a picture of the Seattle Post-Intelligencer. This building is gone now, and what you see on top is now the property of the city, which is trying to find a good place for it. It's the Globe. It's almost as tall as the damn building itself. The Globe on the old PI building. And it's a beautiful, sort of streamlined, modern building. You can see the epochs of architecture in how each of these buildings is manifested. The Chicago Tribune was done in Gothic style, and outside, or inside the Tribune, they have pieces of rock of significance from across the world, like a piece from the Great Wall of China. Supposedly they had a moon rock, but there were inquiries as to how government property came into the hands of the Chicago Tribune. I think that one was either fake or was disappeared one way or the other. Even on, as I mentioned, these small towns that wanted their own newspapers, that were proud of having newspapers, those newspapers were on Main Street because they wanted everyone to see them. Come in and tell us your story. Come in and buy an ad. Here's the Buffalo Voice in Buffalo, Wyoming. As you see there on the right, the Buffalo Voice with the awning. Plenty of parking for your horse out front. You know, no reason to, you know, they might have had valet later on, who knows. And then the small town papers I'm talking about are like the Victor Press up in Victorville. Big letters, big storefront, right on the main street of a small town, but saying, we're here. We're not the LA Times, you know, 80 miles away. We're here for you. This is your paper. Pancake breakfast, obituaries, police logs, those are the stories. I love the police logs because they tell stories like, Woman caller reported burglar in the backyard. Turns out like it was a raccoon. Or woman sees large bird attacking her cat. It was a barbecue cover that had blown off from the next yard. It'd be nice to live in a town where that becomes the police news, wouldn't it? At the opposite end of the Victor Press, you have these grand buildings I talked about. In this case, the Herald Examiner building, designed by Julia Morgan, who was also the architect of Hearst Castle. And this has that Moorish, Spanish mixed quality to it. We weren't afraid of mixing architectural styles. And this building, I've just been told, was bought by the University of Arizona. And it's going to be used for extensions there. It's going to be preserved in its historic context. It is a beautiful building. The last time I was in there, before the Herald folded in 1989, the floors were like this. It was like walking on the deck of a ship with no water under you when you crossed the newsroom there. But it was a thrill to be there. The noise, the vibe of a newsroom just can't be replicated. Now, this one is one that makes me sad. It's a beautiful building. It's the La Crosse Tribune in Wisconsin. And the Tribune is a newspaper that started up because the other papers in town weren't writing about a utility monopoly that was screwing the locals out of thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. So this little newspaper started up, and here is this great streamlined, modern building for the Tribune. Isn't that beautiful? I just love it. It says so much about the era and the style. Of course, like many newspapers, including mine, they've moved out of their historic buildings and have now left. This one has been turned into a crouton factory, I'm sorry to say. So, sorry, what? Oh, this is the sad story of many newspapers these days. Here's the Columbus Citizen Journal with the irresistible headline, "Goodbye, Columbus." But we have seen a resurgence of interest, thankfully, in people who want newspapers to succeed. This is a pro-newspaper demonstration in front of the New York Times. You didn't see that very often. And this, I hope, is our future generation of readers. Underneath it says Mike's cousin. I think he's looking at the want ads for new parents. I know I've gone on and on. I've only got a couple of minutes. I'm happy to stay after with your questions, but if we have one for right now, I'm happy to answer it for you. And thank you. Yes? Poynter Institute and PolitiFact, they won a Pulitzer Prize for this kind of fact-checking that they started long ago. The LA Times used to call it the truth box when we check political ads. But the problem with the internet is it has no topography to tell you which are the mountains of truth and the valleys of lies. And so when you get an institution that's devoted to this fact-checking, like Snopes, for example, but PolitiFact chiefly, it's so useful. And I wish that after every story we would put something at the bottom and say, if you want more information, you can go check it here. It's very hard work, and there are a lot of reporters doing it, and they have their hands full these days. I think it's an important public service. I have time for, I think, one more. Yes?
What is the future of the newspaper?
It may not be paper, but it will still be news. Everybody wants news. Everybody needs news. We may have a paper only on the weekends, but we're always going to be there for you folks. So thank you for supporting and for subscribing. I'm in town all week. Thank you.